It's day one of the Sinkfield Cup, and Magnus Carlsen has now joined the field that was playing in the Rapid and Blitz. So I want to look today at Firouzja versus Caruana and also Carlsen's game against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So we'll start with Alireza here. He had white and he kicks off with pawn c4, the English attack, just what he was playing in all of the Rapid and Blitz. And he was kind of in blitz mode here. So c5 from Caruana, knight f3, knight f6, both knights develop, very symmetrical. e3 from Alireza, prepares d4 very often. e5 from Fabi, so clamps on that move. And now there's a bunch of theory which starts with d4 here. You can take like this and then push e4, sometimes even push e4 straight away, etc. But Alireza didn't play the main move here. He now plays a move which just takes us out of the Lichess database here altogether. So he goes queen b3. And this is what I mean, he was kind of in blitz mode here. I mean, I'm not saying he really was, but it's a blitzy kind of move. It's not a very good move because the queen now left the d file, doesn't support d4, and it sits in front of this b pawn. Very often you actually want an expansion on the queen side, but the queen now sits there. You can't fianchetto the bishop, for example. So d6 from Fabi, d3 from Alireza, and the position's now just level really. They're playing chess here. Now Alireza goes g3 in just a moment. He prepares to fianchetto. He could have gone this way, but he decides not. Castles from Fabi, bishop g2, and now knight to b4 played, so immediately targeting this pawn which was left undefended by queen, by bishop, and guess what? The queen comes back to d1. So not the greatest opening foray from Alireza, but okay, the players are still okay here, level position, and Fabi now finds this really nice break, pawn to d5. Now you're giving a whole pawn here, which Alireza does take. That wasn't forced. You can castle the king here, and then Fabi could kick on with d4. There's a really sharp line ensues after a3. Both knights are kicked. I'll stick with this main computer line, but you could have gone for this kind of Benoni structure. We saw this in Blitz. He smashed Lenier in a game like this. Really nice game. But okay, Alireza didn't want to go for this slightly worse position here. That would have been a grind against Fabi in classical. So instead, he does chop this pawn. Fabi now takes on c4. Pawn recaptures, and he loses now his castling rights, Alireza. So the king recaptures. Now it looks really scary for the white king, but you can just about hold on down the d file due to this d5 square. So say black checks straight away, well now you can go king e2 and you just about get away okay. So instead of encouraging that king to kind of get its running shoes on, now we had knight g4 from Fabi. So he looks to check here. Now we had this knight taking, bishop takes with check, and the king moves here. If you go pawn to f3, this isn't good because the bishop can drop back. You now hit this one with tempo. You've blocked your own bishop. Say b3, well now bishop f6, hitting this knight. The rooks are coming. This really is dangerous for the white king. Not good. So we didn't have f3. The king came to d2. I mean, looks horrible, right? You know, this is the white side of this. You would think this is the black pieces or something that's gone wrong in the opening. But after check here, Alireza just has this saving grace of knight to d5. And it's difficult to budge the piece from that square, supported by bishop and pawn. So bishop e6 was now played by Fabi. He could have tried some b5 stuff, by the way, you know, b3, bishop f6. Alireza just clings on in all of these variations. You know, if you take a pawn, well, then we start developing with tempo, and actually the white pieces come to life. Not to say white is better, but it's kind of equal, just holding on. Anyway, won't go too deep, but you can just about survive. But bishop e6 was played instead. Now e4 came, bolstering the knight, and f5 came. So a different kind of undermining move, other side of the board. And Alireza now plays a good move. You don't want to be capturing this one. Let me flick on the engine here. Yeah, then we're simply chopping everything on d5 basically, you know, not good. So instead Alireza goes bishop to h3 here. He creates this pin, you can't take or you lose a piece with check. And now Fabi nudges his bishop into f6 here. That wasn't actually on prise before due to the pinned knight down this d file. And now Alireza goes king e2. Good move. So he comes off that open d file. Fabi now nudges his rook across. He could have started with knight c2, hitting the rook, then in here with check. Still white can cling on there, but instead he nudges the rook over, adds some protection here, and Alireza develops now, bishop to e3. So he hits this pawn. He also gives this pawn if Fabi wants it. Now if Fabi chops it, well again rook a to b1, bishop goes, a3. Won't go too much deeper on the line, but once again, white can start unraveling, should be roughly level. So instead, after bishop to e3, now we had knight c2, the rook moved, and again Fabi decided, I don't want to plant my knight here with check. Playable move for both players. He chops instead. The pawn recaptures now, takes control of this square, and now takes on e4 played, and the position's roughly level. But the next move really surprised the commentators because it's an unusual positional move. So Alireza chops this one here with check. Now the reason this is unusual is you would expect this move. Takes with check, rook recaptures, and now compare this minor piece to this minor piece. It's a very powerful knight, of course, can't be budged, there's no knight, there's no light squared bishop. Now Alireza said afterwards that after say b3, bishop e5, well he didn't really see that this was anything much at all because black also has a good dark squared bishop, and he is correct, it's not too much for either player, but still would have been probably the more usual way to play. Instead he chops here with check. Now we had a recaptures, these ones came off, and now the d file gets challenged. And the only thing about this endgame is we see all the rooks come off the board, but now it's white that just has to be the tiniest bit careful, because if the black king ever came in, whoops, drawing bad arrows, but ever came in like this, well then you're in trouble. But the problem is, as soon as it gets down, you go pawn h3, you stop that advance, and neither player can make any progress here. Say, for example, you actually tried to chuck this h-pawn. So say here you actually push this one. Well, now you're going to actually end up losing because the white king comes in. So you really can't make any inroads here. So in this position here, this is where we actually had a draw. The players agreed one. So not too much shown there with the white pieces from Alireza. Let's have a look at Carlsen's game here. He was playing Jan Nepomniachtchi. So I'll click over to this one. Magnus also had white. Let's see what happened. So he started with pawn d4, knight f6, c4, pawn to e6, and now as we so commonly see, no knight c3 inviting bishop b4, the Nimzo-Indian. Instead Magnus goes for this one, avoids that, and we had d5 from Jan, takes on d5, pawn recaptures, this so-called Carlsbad structure, knight c3, pawn c6 bolsters the centre, and Magnus brings this bishop to f4 here. So bishop f5 from Jan, good developing move, e3, knight beats d7, pawn h3, gives a bit of room for this bishop maybe, and also Magnus has got some aggressive ideas with that g-pawn now, as we'll see. So the bishop developed here, and now pawn g4 played. If you play something very tame like bishop d3, chop those ones off, it's getting very, very drawish, very fast. So instead g4, and now the bishop bounced in here. It looks like you'd want to just snap that one off instantly, pick up the bishop pair. But the only thing with this line is you bring the knight in, and you're probably helping black really improve their position more than the white position. I mean, now this knight has moved, for example. Well, after say this bishop develops, you can go pawn h5. And you're not running into g5, hitting a knight, you know, you've opened the queen and bishop battery, and black's absolutely fine, nibbling away, you know, not ideal for white. So instead Magnus holds off. After this move of bishop e4, he goes bishop e2 developing, queen b6 played, hits this pawn, and now Magnus defends like this, so he accepts doubled pawns if Jan wants to take, which he does. Not a bad move at all, because it weakens this square quite badly. You know, the bishop can now sit there for a very long time, we see that soon, but in compensation, Magnus opens up his rook, and on a good day, he'd be able to get b4 in, try and clamp on this c5 break. So bishop to g6 now from Jan. He decides he does want to tuck back, maybe put a knight there one day, then the other one's free to move. Knight to h4 from Magnus. He goes after the bishop pair. Bishop b4 played, knight chops here, pawn recaptures, and now he goes f3. So it's not much at all here for white. It's very, very level. But Magnus does have the bishops. And the other thing is he has a slightly more fluid pawn structure in the centre here. You know, he's holding on to a few breaks, h4, g5, maybe e4 at the right moment. And it's never so easy for black to arrange c5. So knight f8 now from Jan. Nice manoeuvre coming in here. King to f2, knight e6. The bishop nudges back. And now king e7 connects those rooks. Magnus goes h4 and Jan now goes a6. And it's really interesting to listen to the interviews afterwards, because Magnus was saying here that he felt that conceptually a5 was actually better, just bolstering this bishop here. Although it could become weak later, he wasn't really seeing how he could exploit that one, he was saying. So always very subtle cat and mouse stuff at this top level of chess. But Jan goes a6, logical move, frees this rook to move. Now king g2 played, gives this bishop some room. The rook came to the d-file, and Magnus already tucks back. Sometimes this will support e4, and he also wanted to anticipate this move, bishop to d6, which Jan now plays. He wants to avoid exchanging the bishops, keep his bishop pair on the board. So bishop d3 from Magnus, ever so subtle improvement. And now what should Jan do here? He's solid, but his pawn structure is pretty fixed. Not the kind of position he loves. And he makes a big inaccuracy here. Now when you run this with the engines, one of the top plans is to just go king d7, c7, b8, kind of run that king to some safety here. Instead he drops this bishop back to b8, but suddenly he's left some control of c5, a very key battleground, and Magnus pounces with knight to a4. Now the bishop drops back, and it might look like an insignificant tempo, but now you get bishop e1, another piece coming round to look at these dark squares. And Jan realises that if Magnus gets, say, b4, he's getting a very big bind on the position. Positionally, this is getting now really uncomfortable for Jan. So he decides to break with pawn to c5. But this allows Magnus to now rip open the position for his bishops here. Now he takes with the knight. He said this was a bit unprofessional because he should have taken with the pawn, because now Jan had this opportunity to take with bishop, pawn recaptures, and kick on with d4. Now this still would have been good for white, and Magnus was reflecting that still this was better for him, but he said it was a bit unprofessional to even allow this option. But Jan didn't take with bishop. He chopped with knight, pawn recaptures, bishop takes, bishop d2, covered this pawn, and now he brought this rook to the centre, looking to move the king, add pressure here, and Magnus goes b4. So the bishop drops back, and now he kicks on. And this is the big challenge now. Jan actually ditches a pawn here, because if he captures, well then these bishops really come to life. So you're hitting this rook. Now if you block with the knight, the problem is bishop b4 check, the king is being drawn up the board, and then pawn e4. And without going any deeper on the line here, the position's getting ripped open, the king's in the centre, the rooks are coming. This is really bad for black. And if instead of knight d7 you move this rook here, well now we check, king moves, and again there's stuff like g5, knight moves, e4. It's just a really big attack coming in against the black king. That's not where you want your king to be. So that's why Jan didn't take. He ditches a pawn. a5 played, bishop captures, he does pick up one of those bishops, but after king d6, this is just a miserable position to defend. This is weak, this is weak, this is looking pretty weak, and Magnus just has all the kind of attacking threats here, the pawn breaks, the better minor piece, the more active rooks. So king f2 was played, covers this weakness, rook to e7, covers this, prepares to double. Now we had rook d1, lining up against the king, and now the rook came to h8, trying to exploit the weakness of the last move. So Magnus kicks on with g5. If you come to h5 here, well your knight's not going anywhere, plus you block the rook, so it drops back here. Rook a4 now played, covers this pawn, and now here Jan goes knight c5. Again Magnus mentioned that knight b6 was really the best chance to fight, because from b6 you actually cover this pawn here, add some protection. But after knight c5, well now the rook slides across, and this pawn is just impossible to defend. If you chop off like this, by the way, well again it's still just a hopelessly bad endgame, because these rooks are just so much better than the counterparts, so is the pawn structure. So instead Jan goes king c7 here, And now bishop b1 played. It's bouncing around here to target this pawn. Rook e5 covers. Bishop a2, and you can't start doing this. Then we just add another firepower. You can't save the pawn. So Jan desperately tries f6, but Magnus captures, pawn recaptures, takes on d5, and he's now 2 pawns ahead. This is game over. So a few more moves were played here. Knight d3 check, the king moved. Now the knight bounced back, but the rook hit f4, both defending and attacking, always a beautiful thing in a rook endgame. And now rook d8 was played, hits this bishop, and Magnus kicks on with b6 check. This was actually the final move of the game. Now if this pawn is captured, well then we take here with check. This is the problem. King moves, and then you can either take on b7, or you can be really sadistic, go pawn e4, just bolster that bishop. You're 2 pawns ahead, and the remaining black pawns are critically weak. So a real crush from Magnus, and Jan just didn't put up much resistance, kind of capitulated. So on day 1, Magnus was the only one to win. All other games were drawn, and we move into day 2. I'll try get a highlight up tonight, depends on the timing really. If not, it'll be tomorrow. It's quite late for me when the games finish. I hope you enjoyed this one. Do consider subscribing to the channel if you never want to miss a future video, and see another amazing crush, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.